I reached the ridge a little after sunset. The sky pressed low on the Appalachia hills. The map said the outpost had been cold for years, but the tower on the crest blinked a faint red pulse through the fog. It looked steady, like someone had tested it minutes earlier. Our two trucks rolled to a stop at the gate, engines ticking as they cooled. I stepped out and felt the damp cut straight through my sleeves. The gravel shifted under my boots in a way that made the place feel lived in, not abandoned. The lock on the chain was the right kind, same keyway they issued us, but the metal showed fresh scratch marks. Someone had opened it not long before we arrived. Inside the fence, I saw a dim glow behind one of the block buildings. It could have been an old generator running on fumes. It could have been something else. The air carried no sound, only the weight of the hill holding its breath. I remember thinking this was supposed to be a quiet task. Only 2 days, no surprises. Yet nothing about that first minute matched the brief. And everything after that minute followed the same pattern. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe. Your support means everything. I used to think stateside work would feel simple after my tour overseas. That autumn proved me wrong. Our detachment came from Bragg with the usual mix of older hands and young men on their first real assignment. I was in my early 30s then, serving as a staff sergeant. One tour in Afghanistan sat heavy on me, and I carried it the way most of us did, quiet and close. When the company commander told me we were heading into the Appalachia Hills for a 2-day guard shift at an empty outpost, I treated it like a chance to breathe. No enemy, no long patrols. Just hold the ground and wait for contractors. The ride up from the valley set a different tone. The mountain roads tightened the higher we climbed. Trees leaned over the path, soaked from days of rain. Fog pushed in and hid the switchbacks until we were nearly on top of them. Our two trucks crawled forward with low beams cutting short cones through the mist. I rode in the lead truck with our radio man beside me. Halfway up the ridge, he tapped the handset because an old signal format came through. It sounded clipped, broken, but it used a pattern I had not heard since my deployment. It should not have been on our net anywhere in that region. He checked the settings twice. Nothing seemed wrong with the gear. We shrugged it off. There was no other choice on that narrow climb. The outpost sat near the crown of the ridge, tucked behind a line of spruce. When the trees parted, we saw the tower first, tall but rusted at the joints. The beacon blinked with a slow rhythm that did not belong to a dead site. The brief had said the tower had been deactivated years earlier. Seeing that pulse push through the fog felt like someone clearing their throat before speaking. I kept my thoughts to myself. The younger men already looked twitchy in the half-light. The gate stood intact, but had no sign of age. No leaves piled at its base, no rust on the chain. The lock was government issue and opened with our key on the first try. The hinges made no sound when I swung the gate wide. For a site left empty, it had the neat look of a place checked often. We parked inside the fence and kept the engines warm until I felt sure the ground was safe. The buildings were small concrete blocks with metal roofs, the kind used for remote comm stations decades earlier. One window showed a faint yellow glow. It was not bright enough to be a full power source, more like a lantern or an old bulb running on a generator tucked away behind the structure. I sent 2 men to check the perimeter. They came back with nothing strange to report, only wet brush and a narrow trail running down the far side of the ridge. I stepped into the first building with my rifle up. Dust lay on most surfaces, but on the table near the far wall, I saw a mug with dried coffee at the bottom. That told me someone had been here recently. The generator behind the building ran with a low, steady vibration. It sounded clean, as if maintained often. The other buildings showed small signs of use. A bunk room held 2 made cots and one unmade one with a dent in the pillow. A locker stood half open with a set of fatigues folded neatly on a shelf. No name tape, no unit patch. In the comm shack, a logbook sat open on the desk. The last entries were dated only a few days earlier. Each entry had a call sign I did not recognize, though the pen marks looked fresh. Someone had written in a firm, even hand. Whoever it was had left in a hurry or had stepped out planning to return. I radioed the battalion operations center. They confirmed again that the site was empty and had no assigned personnel. I reported the signs of activity. They told us to stay put, hold security, and wait for the contractors the next morning. Their voice sounded normal, but the delay before they answered made my neck tighten. The fog thickened as night settled. It moved around the buildings in slow sheets. The cold crept into my jacket and made each breath feel heavier. My men stayed close without being told. When the tower light blinked, I saw the glow reflect on damp metal, then fade again, then return in a steady rhythm. I counted the seconds between each pulse without meaning to. It felt like something old and patient watching us settle in. We set the perimeter, marked the cleared rooms, and assigned watches. Nothing about those first hours made sense with the brief we had been given. The site looked too tended for an abandoned post, yet too empty for an active one. Each small clue pointed in two directions at once, and neither direction led anywhere clear. The wind shifted and carried the faint smell of wet stone and old soil. I walked the line one more time, checked each man, and returned to the comms building. The logbook still lay open, as if waiting for the next entry. I closed it gently and placed it back where I found it. That was the moment I realized the place was not empty in the way people meant when they used that word. Something had shaped the area before us, and our arrival barely stirred its surface. The ridge felt settled around us, as if it expected us and had plans of its own. I stayed in the comm shack longer than I meant to. The room held the kind of quiet that makes a person think someone had stepped out only moments earlier. A faint hum came from the old equipment racks, steady and patient, though none of the panels showed any real activity. Most of the dials sat at 0. A switch near the center was set to a mode I did not recognize. I left it alone. I had learned long ago that touching unknown settings after dark rarely helps. Outside, the fog pushed closer. My men moved between posts with calm steps, keeping their shapes loose and sure. They trusted me, and I felt that weight on my shoulders as the night deepened. I handed the shack to the next watch and walked toward the bunkhouse. The gravel shifted under my boots again, each small crunch placing me back in memory of other nights far from home. The pattern felt regular, almost even, something a person remembers long after the sound fades. Inside the bunkhouse, the air carried the faint warmth of bodies that had stayed there before us. The cot with the dented pillow had not changed shape. I checked the lockers again. The folded fatigues looked plain at first glance, yet the cut of the fabric seemed slightly older than current issue. Not by much, just enough for me to notice. I ran my hand across the cloth. It felt dry and unused, as if waiting for the right moment. My radio man sat at a small table near the window. He had the handset clipped to his vest, testing channels in short patterns. He stopped when he heard me enter. His eyes asked a question he did not voice. I shook my head. "Nothing new," I said. He nodded and returned to scanning in slow intervals, listening for any trace of the strange signal we had caught on the climb. Around midnight, something shifted in the air. It was not a noise or a movement, more like the ridge settling in a different way. I stepped outside and took a slow look around. The tower stood to my right, its red blink cutting through the fog in steady rhythm. The light reached the ground, then dimmed, then returned. Each pulse gave the ridge an outline for a moment before hiding it again. The pattern never broke. I checked the comm shack one more time. When I turned the corner, I saw a faint shine on the door handle. Rain had not been steady enough to coat it like that. I tried it. The door opened smoothly. The lock responded as though used earlier. Inside, nothing had moved. The logbook stayed closed where I placed it. Still, the room felt different, as if someone had stood in the doorway after I left. I marked it and moved on. The night carried long stretches of stillness. During one of those stretches, a young private approached and asked if he could warm his hands near the generator exhaust. I nodded but warned him not to wander. He returned after a short while with a strange look on his face. He said the generator sounded too steady for an old machine. I checked the panel myself. Every gauge read clean. The fuel feed looked full, no leaks showed along the line. Around 2 in the morning, I gathered the squad in the bunkhouse for a short update. I kept my words simple. "We hold the site," I said. "We wait for daylight. No one moves alone." The men listened. None asked questions. They felt the ridge the same way I did. When the meeting broke, I walked alone to the far edge of the perimeter. The fog moved in long strands, drifting across the wire. I saw marks on the ground that did not belong to us. They looked like prints from older boots, maybe made days earlier. They led toward the tree line, then stopped where the ground turned soft. I knelt and touched one. Moisture had pooled in the center, meaning it had not been made recently. Still, the shape remained clear. The ridge held old stories. Many places like that did. I had heard enough during my career to know mountains remember footsteps longer than people expect. Still, something about the spacing bothered me. The pattern matched the way our own men walked that evening. Not exact, but close enough to stir a feeling I did not enjoy. Back at the bunkhouse, I found the injured private resting on his cot. He had twisted his knee during a climb earlier and needed to stay off it. I checked his leg. The swelling was mild. He kept his eyes on the ceiling while I worked. "Feels strange in here," he said softly. I asked what he meant. He said the air felt heavy, like someone had walked past him moments before. He shrugged it off, convinced it was only nerves. I let it be. Near dawn, the fog thinned just enough to show the slope below the fence. A faint path wound down toward the valley. It looked barely used, almost forgotten. The brief had not mentioned any civilian trails on the ridge. I made a note to check it after sunrise. At that moment, the tower blink caught my eye again, steady and slow. The light reflected off a patch of wet gravel near the shack. Something in that reflection made me think of another time, another place where things had not lined up cleanly. Back inside the comm shack, I checked the panels once more. A faint glow pulsed behind one of the gauges, something I had not noticed earlier. When the gauge dimmed again, the glow vanished. I opened the small cabinet near the desk. Inside were maps of the valley, pinned at the corners, routes marked in thin pencil trace lines along the ridge. Some matched our patrol plan exactly. I looked for dates. None showed. The handwriting on the routes resembled the notes in the logbook, though the pressure on the pencil seemed firmer on these maps. I placed the cabinet door back into position and stepped outside. The ridge remained quiet. My men held their posts with steady discipline. We were meant to be alone up there, yet nothing supported that idea. Everything pointed to recent use, careful and deliberate, though no person stood to claim it. As the sky took on its first pale color, I felt certain the hill held more history than anyone told us. And whatever shape that history had not cleared the ground for our arrival. Dawn never broke clean. The sky turned a thin gray, and the ridge held the light at the edges like it was not ready to let the day in. We moved slow, checking each post, marking our positions again. My radio man stayed close to me as we circled the fence line. He kept glancing at his handset, waiting for that strange pattern to return. I stayed focused on the ground, looking for anything new. The old prints we saw during the night had softened. Fresh moisture filled them, yet their edges stayed sharp. That detail bothered me more than I wanted to admit. By mid-morning, the fog pushed out in patches, giving brief views of the valley below. A long, narrow road wound through the trees, empty at that hour. The contractors were supposed to come up that way. No engine noise carried from the valley. No movement showed on the bends. When I called battalion to ask for an update, the answer came a few seconds late. The voice said weather delays might slow the convoy. I glanced at the sky, then at the road, both clear enough for travel. Something in the tone of the reply felt measured, as though the speaker was reading from a line. We set a small observation post near the access road. 2 men stayed there with a thermal scope and a signal panel. They had direct sight on the bends below and could call out any movement long before it reached us. I trusted both of them, steady men who did not scare easy. I told them to rotate every few hours. They nodded and settled into place. Back at the outpost, I checked the comm shack again. The maps in the cabinet had not shifted. The logbook stayed closed. Yet the chair near the desk sat at a slightly different angle. It could have been one of my men. It could have been something else. I left it as I found it and met with the squad near the generator. The young private with the knee injury sat on a crate with his leg raised. His eyes tracked the tower beyond the fence, watching the blink with an uneasy focus. Around noon, the ridge grew colder. A thin layer of mist slid back between the trees and made the air damp again. My radio man said the static on our channel rose and fell in a strange pattern, almost tied to the tower blink. I asked him to record it, and he took out a small device from his pouch. Each time the blink faded, the static dipped. Each time the light returned, the static swelled again. The pattern held steady for several minutes, then broke without warning. The sound had no clear message, yet it carried a rhythm that felt familiar. Not a voice, not a code. Something between the two, like a distant signal reaching through layers of interference. I told him to keep the device running and to store each clip. The observation post radioed in around early afternoon. They had picked up shapes on thermal along the tree line below, faint and not close enough to mark clearly. The shapes moved in slow arcs, never crossing into open ground. When the men switched to white light, the slope showed nothing. The shapes returned once the thermal lens cooled again. I had seen enough strange readings in rough terrain to know thermal scopes can play tricks. Still, I sent a 3-man team down the fence to check from another angle. We moved together through the brush near the edge. The ground sloped sharply, making each step careful. A few yards from the wire, the brush opened just enough to see the lower slope. I scanned it with my binoculars. Nothing moved. No prints, no broken branches, no sign of the shapes reported minutes before. I called the observation post. They said the shapes had faded. They had not seen anything since. As we returned to the outpost, the gravel under my boots gave that same steady shift I had heard the night before. It matched the rhythm in the radio static. A strange sense washed through me, like the ridge remembered the sound before I made it. I kept my thoughts to myself. My men stayed close, waiting for my direction. By late afternoon, the sky darkened again. A light rain came in steady streaks. It ran along the roofs and settled in shallow pools around the outpost. The generator kept its calm vibration, cutting through the damp. The tower blinked through the mist. The timing never changed. My radio man pulled me aside. He said he heard a fragment of a message on one of the secure channels. He could not catch the full thing, only a short call for help followed by a burst of static. The voice used an old authentication phrase we both knew from years earlier. It hit me harder than I expected. That phrase belonged to a soldier we had lost overseas. No one in our current units used it anymore. I checked the recording. The voice sounded distant, blurred by interference, yet shaped in a way that made my stomach tighten. I told him to lock that file and not share it with the squad. No point stirring fear without clear facts. As the rain grew heavier, I assigned new positions and doubled the watch near the comm shack. Something about the place drew attention, even with no movement inside. My injured private tried to stand, winced, and lowered himself again. He asked if we could move him to a truck to rest. I allowed it but posted another man with him. No one sat alone that day. Night returned early. The ridge sank into deep shadow. My radio man adjusted frequencies in slow turns, listening for the strange signal again. I walked the perimeter with a steady pace, keeping my senses sharp. Each time the tower blinked, the fog near the tree line seemed to hold its shape for a heartbeat before drifting. I watched it more than I wanted to. Close to 1600 hours, the observation post called again. They picked up movement near the lower switchback. Not vehicles, not animals. The scope showed tall shapes with human outline, standing near the road and then stepping back into the trees. No sound reached us. No tracks showed when I sent 2 men down to check the area. Whatever moved did not leave prints on the damp soil. The men returned unsettled. I did not blame them. The ridge carried a quiet that felt older than any outpost or trail. It watched us in ways I could not explain. We gathered near the bunkhouse as the last of the light faded. I gave clear instructions. No one moved beyond marked posts. Radio stayed open. If anything approached the fence line, we regrouped at the comm shack. The men listened without argument. They felt the shift in the hill as much as I did. The rain eased for a moment. In that brief pause, the static on our channel rose again, soft but steady. My radio man looked at me with the same uneasy question I carried inside. The ridge waited, the night waited with it. Night settled in without a clear line between dusk and darkness. The ridge seemed to draw the last light down into the soil. My men tightened their jackets and stayed close to their posts. The fog thickened again, stretching across the perimeter in long, slow bands. It reminded me of dust storms overseas, how they could hide movement long enough to change everything. I checked on the injured private first. He rested in the truck with his leg raised, eyes half closed. The man beside him kept a steady grip on his rifle. They both looked toward the fence often, not saying anything. The younger one asked if the shapes seen on thermal could be hunters. I shook my head. Hunters do not move like that. They do not vanish into the ground without leaving prints. He took in my answer quietly. Across the yard, the comm shack gave off a faint glow from a single bulb inside. I headed that way with my radio man. The gravel shifted under each of my steps in a familiar pattern, the same even sound from the night before. It put a picture in my mind of the footprints we found earlier, the ones spaced too close to our own. I pushed that thought aside as we approached the shack. Inside, the air felt colder than the outside. The equipment racks looked unchanged, yet the faint hum had a different pitch. My radio man tested the channels in slow turns. For a moment, everything stayed quiet. Then a soft rise of static filled the room, building in the same rhythm as the tower blink. We both watched the panels. A gauge near the center flickered once. When it steadied, the static dipped. He leaned closer. I placed a hand on his shoulder and told him to step back. The room held an edge. I did not want him standing inside. We left the shack and headed toward the far perimeter. 2 men stood watch there with their rifles at low ready. One of them pointed toward the tree line when we approached. He said he saw a brief shift in the fog, a shape sliding through before fading. He could not mark it as a person. He only felt the movement rather than saw it. I scanned the area. Nothing broke the surface. The fog held steady. The observation post called again near 2000 hours. Their voices stayed low, measured. They had seen 3 shapes on thermal near the lower bend of the access road. The shapes did not walk. They drifted in a slow arc before stopping at the edge of the trees. When I asked if they could confirm height or distance, the reply came unsure. The shapes did not have a clear outline. They only had the heat of bodies. I gathered a 3-man team and moved down toward the lower section of the fence. The rain had weakened into a thin mist. The earth felt soft under our boots. Each step carried a weight of tension none of us tried to hide. When we reached the wire, I signaled the men to stay low. I scanned the slope with care. The thermal scope we brought with us showed nothing. No heat signatures, no movement, only the cold shape of the land. We waited for several minutes. The fog shifted once, then settled again. Not a sound traveled up from the valley. The quiet had a density that made each breath feel heavier. When I finally gave the signal to move back, each man rose with steady caution. Back at the outpost, the young private with the injured knee looked worse. His skin had grown pale, and he said he felt a pressure in his chest, like something heavy resting on him. I checked in closely. His pulse stayed normal. His breathing held steady, but his eyes drifted often toward the window, following the tower blink. I moved him deeper into the bunkhouse, away from the view. The rest of the squad stayed alert as the hours passed. The fog never lifted. The tower blink created a faint halo each time it cut through the mist. My radio man returned with new recordings. He said another clip message came through, softer this time. The same voice pattern as before. The same old authentication we should not have heard. When I listened, the hair on my neck lifted. The message ended with a short breath before static washed it out. Close to midnight, the observation post reported new movement. This time the shapes came closer. They stopped near the edge of the road, too near for comfort. I ordered everyone to tighten positions. No one would go out again, not until we knew more. The fog pressed against the fence line with slow drifting strokes. My men watched it like they expected someone to step out any moment. The air carried a weight that made the ridge feel smaller, like the world had shrunk to a small circle of ground. I stood near the comm shack for a moment, looking at the door handle. A thin drop of moisture hung on the metal. It slid down and fell onto the gravel. The ground shifted just lightly at the point where the drop landed. I stared at it longer than I should have, sensing something in the soil, as if the ridge remembered other nights like this. The static on our net began to rise again. Soft at first, then steady. The rhythm matched the blink of the tower with such precision that it felt deliberate. My radio man looked at me with a question he did not know how to ask. I had no answer to give him. The ridge waited again, silent and watchful, and the night did not feel empty in any direction. The second night settled harder than the first. The ridge felt smaller, like the fog had folded the ground around us. My men stayed at their posts with tight focus. No one talked unless needed. The static on our net rose and dipped in an uneven pulse, never fully clear, never fully gone. I stood near the comm shack doorway, watching the panels glow faintly inside. The tower blink cast a thin red reflection across the wet gravel each time it cut through the dark. Close to 2200 hours, my radio man stepped toward me with his handset held tight. He said we had a new call on the satellite channel. The voice claimed to be division operations. The tone sounded calm, firm, and sure of itself. The message ordered us to move into an escalated scenario, treat any unknown movement as a hostile force, and prepare for full defensive action. The voice used the correct authentication. The phrases matched current protocol. There was no reason to doubt it on paper. Before I could answer, our battalion net came alive with a second message. This one sounded normal, close, and familiar. It said no training event existed in the area. It instructed us to hold fire unless we faced a direct threat. The battalion officer repeated that the outpost was an inactive site with no units assigned. He told me the contractors had turned around due to weather, though no heavy weather sat anywhere near the ridge. 2 channels, 2 sets of orders, both correct by verification, both confident in tone, neither matching the situation on the ground. My radio man looked at me with steady eyes. He trusted my judgment. I asked him to record everything. He nodded and stored each message in clean files. I stepped away from the shack and walked toward the bunkhouse. The ridge gave no answer. The fog hovered in slow tides brushing against the fence line. Inside the bunkhouse, the injured private lay awake with a tense expression. I checked his knee again. The swelling had grown slightly. His breathing stayed even, but he kept glancing toward the door, as though expecting someone to walk in. I asked him what he felt. He said he had dreamed earlier about men moving through the halls, men wearing older uniforms with blank patches. He said he woke before seeing their faces. I told him to rest. He nodded but did not look convinced. I gathered the squad in a tight group outside. I explained the conflicting orders and told them we would stay defensive, not aggressive. No one fired unless we saw a clear threat. My men accepted it without pushback. They felt the strangeness of the place. They knew the hill held something none of us understood. After the meeting, I walked alone to the comm shack. The night air pressed close, thick enough to feel on my skin. When I stepped inside, I noticed the map cabinet slightly open. I'd closed it earlier. I pulled it wider. The maps had shifted by a fraction, enough to create a small gap along one edge. Beneath them, on the wooden backing, faint pencil marks showed through. I cleared the maps carefully. A line of old notes hid beneath the cork. The writing listed a program name I recognized only from rumor, something spoken about in low tones during my early years in service. A test for unit cohesion in unknown conditions. Stories said it went too far. Stories said men suffered real harm, while leadership claimed it was only training. None of those stories had dates. None had proof. Yet the phrase under the maps matched those rumors. And below it, in smaller writing, sat our own names beside call signs. Not recent names. Not recent call signs. Ones we had used in earlier years. I felt a tightening in my chest. My radio man stepped into the doorway behind me. He saw the look on my face and asked if everything was fine. I told him to keep it between us for now. He agreed without hesitation. As I closed the cabinet, the static on our channel rose again, sharper this time, almost like someone exhaling through interference. The tower blink lit the room a faint red for a moment, then faded. Nothing about that moment felt like coincidence. I left the comm shack with the map still in my mind. The ridge carried a quiet pressure, heavy enough that each step felt measured. My radio man followed a few paces behind, keeping the recorder active. The fog wrapped around the fence in slow drifting lines, thinning just enough to show the silhouettes of the buildings. The tower blink cut across the yard at steady intervals, lighting the ground in brief red strokes before darkness settled again. I went straight to the trucks. The air smelled faintly of damp metal and old fuel. I asked one of the men to fire up the first engine. He tried once, nothing happened. He tried again, no ignition. The click carried through the cold air with a muted finality. I told him to check the battery connections. He lifted the hood and leaned in. The cable sat in place, yet both batteries looked drained. Not low, empty, as if someone had run them through a full cycle during the short window when no one was watching. I moved to the second truck with 2 more men. We repeated the check. The engine did not turn. The battery showed no life. When we examined the fuel line, I saw a neat cut near the clamp. Not jagged, not rushed. The kind made by a careful hand. The men looked at me, waiting for my call. I told them to stay alert. Leaving the ridge on foot in that fog would be worse than staying put. A faint sound drifted from the tree line. It was not a step or a branch snap. More like the shift of air when someone moves slowly through brush. My men raised their rifles without a word. The fog opened for a brief second, showing the faint outline of a figure near the lower slope. It vanished before any of us could mark a clear shape. The observation post confirmed a heat signature moving along the slope, but when they tried to track it, the signature split into 2 and then faded. I ordered everyone to pull back toward the buildings. We set a tighter perimeter, stacking supplies near the comm shack where the ground sat highest. My men placed claymores along the fence line, marking each one with careful precision. No one wasted movement. No one asked questions. Survival instincts settle fast when the ground beneath a person shifts from uncertain to threatening. Inside the bunkhouse, the injured private sat upright, breathing a little harder than earlier. His pulse stayed steady, but his eyes seemed distant. He said he felt like he had been here before, though he had never been anywhere near these mountains. I checked his forehead. It felt cool. No fever. But something in his voice carried a tone I had heard from wounded men in other places, an instinctive recognition of danger without a clear source. I stepped outside to check the fences. When I reached the far post, I noticed a faint trail of prints circling our own. Not deep, not clear, but set in a pattern too, even to be random. The prints followed our earlier patrol path with unsettling precision, matching our spacing through the brush as if someone had shadowed each step we took. One set curved around my own earlier route. I crouched beside it. The soil looked fresh, yet the moisture in the print had settled as if the track had been there longer than it should have been. The tower blinked again, lighting the print for a moment, giving it shade before the darkness returned. My radio man called softly from behind me. He had caught another message. He played the recording through a small speaker. The voice was calm, clipped, and familiar. It matched the tone of a man I once served with, a man who died overseas. The recording said our squad was moving through structures, marking rooms, checking angles. The message described our exact actions from earlier that day. Each detail matched what happened. Then the voice ended, followed by a faint breath before static erased the line. My hands tightened around the recording device. None of this fit any training I knew. No red cell group I had ever heard of operated like this. No simulation reached into our past call signs. And nothing explained how the ridge produced signals from voices long gone. The fog pushed closer again, settling against the wire as though the hill itself leaned in to listen. The night had changed. We were no longer guarding an empty site. We were caught inside something older, something built with layers of history none of us had been told. I walked back toward the comm shack with my men following in silence. The static on our net rose and fell with a strange patience, almost breathing with the pulse of the tower. We had entered a situation no brief had warned us about, and the ridge was not done with us yet. The ridge held its breath as the third night began. The fog pressed tight against the buildings, shifting in slow patterns that made the outpost feel smaller by the hour. My men stayed close to their posts, rifles up, minds sharp. No one talked unless needed. The static on our net rose in long waves, dipping only when the tower blinked. Each pulse felt timed. Each break felt planned. Around 2300 hours, the observation post called in with strained voices. They had picked up movement again, this time closer than before. The shapes on thermal were no longer drifting. They stood near the lower fence, tall and still, as if waiting for something. When the men tried white light, nothing showed. The beam cut through the fog and lit only the wire. I ordered the squad to pull tight around the comm shack and bunkhouse. We placed our strongest men along the east and south sides. My radio man stayed close to me with the recorder active. The injured private sat inside the bunkhouse with another soldier watching him. His breathing stayed shallow. His eyes tracked the walls, as if hearing something we could not. The first burst of fire hit near the east post. A round cracked past the guard's cheek and cut into the corner of the roof. He dropped low and called out contact. My men shifted instantly. More rounds struck the ground near the fence, spaced in deliberate intervals. The fire was aimed but not rushed, as though someone knew our layout well enough to test the edges before pushing closer. I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. No muzzle flashes, no silhouettes. The fog swallowed everything past a few meters. My men waited for my signal. I told them to hold fire until they saw a clear shape. I would not have us shooting at empty hills. Another round struck the ground, then another. This time, the impacts formed a neat line toward the bunkhouse. One round chipped the doorframe. The soldier inside yelled that the injured private was getting worse. His pulse had weakened and his breathing had turned shallow. I moved toward the bunkhouse to check him. The air inside felt dense. He lay on his cot with his hands curled near his chest. His skin had gone cold. The soldier watching him said he had been whispering something about hearing steps in the hall, though no one had walked near the bunkhouse for several minutes. I asked him what he heard. He said he could not understand the words, only the rhythm of walking, the same even pacing we had heard on the gravel the night before. Outside, the fire kept coming, slow and measured. My radio man called me over with urgency in his eyes. He handed me the handset. The recording played on a loop. It was the same old voice as before, calm and steady, describing an outpost being hit on a ridge. The message named our grid. It gave details about dead ground, firing angles, and troop positions. The recording sounded decades old, yet it fit our situation perfectly. The last line before the static said the outpost was about to be overrun. I placed the handset down with a slow breath. The ridge felt alive in a way that made the hairs on my arms rise. My men looked to me for direction, trusting whatever I said next. More rounds struck the fence, then the dirt near the comm shack. My men fired warning shots into the fog, aiming low. The muzzle flashes lit small circles before fading into the darkness. The fog swallowed the sound quickly, as though the ridge absorbed it. Then the return fire changed. Instead of single shots, a short burst swept across the ground near the east post. The soldier there yelled as a round grazed his arm. He stayed upright, steady, and shifted position. My men responded with controlled fire, hitting nothing but fog and cold air. The static on our net rose sharply. My radio man tried clearing the channel. The static only grew louder. Within it, faint words surfaced, carrying that same familiar pattern. A voice called our squad by the names we used years earlier. The tone carried no panic, only calm instruction, as though guiding us through a drill we had forgotten. The rounds came faster now. Windows shattered. A storage barrel toppled. The ridge felt like it leaned inward. My men tightened around me in a protective ring, eyes searching the fog for any clear target. I realized then that we would not last the night if we stayed in place. Whoever or whatever controlled the fire knew our positions by heart. The comm shack pulsed with a faint glow behind me, and the tower blink cut through the fog with the same even rhythm. The shack sat at the highest point. If any heart to this whole thing existed, it stood behind that metal door. I made the call. We would shut the site down. I pulled 2 steady men with me. One carried extra batteries. One carried a breaching kit. My radio man kept close. The rest of the squad held the perimeter, firing only when the rounds got too close. Each man knew the risk. Not one hesitated. We moved toward the shack in a low crouch. The fog brushed our legs. The gravel shifted under our boots with that same old rhythm, steady enough to track. My pulse matched it without meaning to. The tower blink lit the path in brief, soft flashes. Each flash gave us a glimpse of the ground ahead, enough to move, not enough to see the full ridge. Another burst of fire swept wide, missing us by inches. A bullet struck the wall behind my shoulder, throwing small chips of concrete across my sleeve. I kept moving. So did my men. When we reached the shack, the hum inside sounded stronger than before, almost like the old equipment recognized our approach. I placed my hand on the door handle. Everything in me understood this was the roll of the dice we could not avoid. The metal handle felt colder than the night air. I eased the door open and the hinges moved without sound. Inside, the shack glowed with a soft green cast from old panels along the far wall. None of them should have held power, yet each one pulsed with a slow rise and fall, almost like breathing. My 2 men entered behind me, rifles up, steady. The room smelled of old wiring and damp concrete. A tape machine near the center ran on its own spool, turning at a steady pace. The strip of tape slid across the head with a faint whisper. My radio man stepped closer and leaned in. The voice coming from the machine carried a clear pattern, listing our positions, our shift rotations, and our movements from earlier. Every detail matched our day. I reached out and stopped the spool with a firm touch. The room fell quiet at once. The static on our net dipped sharply, then rose again from a different side of the ridge. The tower blink outside faded for a moment before returning with a softer light. My 2 men checked the corners. They found nothing. No recent footprints. No dropped gear. Only old stains on the concrete near the far wall, too dry to date. A faint line of dust marked the floor, showing the machine had been moved recently, though no prints traced the movement. I followed the wiring along the baseboard. The cables ran behind a metal panel. When I pulled it loose, a small junction box revealed itself, older than anything still in use. Several wires had been spliced with fresh tape. Someone had worked on the system, and not long ago. I signaled to my men. We disconnected the main feed first, then each smaller line. The hum in the room thinned. The lights dimmed. The lights dimmed. My radio man said the static on our channel dropped at the same moment. Outside, the gunfire stopped. We stepped out of the shack into a stillness that felt wrong in its own way. The fog hung lower, but no longer pushed against the fence. The tower blink faded slowly, then went dark. My men at the perimeter looked shaken, but unharmed. The rounds that had struck the ground no longer came. No movement showed along the tree line. The ridge sat in full silence, holding the kind of calm that comes only after something has finished what it was doing. I checked the injured private once more. His color had returned, and he breathed with more strength than earlier. He said he felt the pressure lift from his chest the moment the tower light died. He could not explain why. None of us could. We held our positions until the first thin light touched the trees. When I checked the access road at dawn, the fallen rock that blocked our way had vanished. Not shifted, not cleared, vanished. The soil beneath it sat clean, as if nothing had fallen there at all. One of the trucks started on the first try. The engine turned smooth, like it had been serviced during the night. The other truck remained dead, but its fuel line showed no cuts. The men looked at me with questions I had no answers for. We packed what we could and rolled down the ridge slowly, watching the tower fade behind us. No fire followed. No shapes tracked our movement. The outpost stayed silent, locked in the thinning fog, as though it had never been touched. When we reached the valley road, the ridge looked ordinary again, a simple line of trees against the pale sky. But nothing about the ground above felt ordinary to me anymore. We reached the valley a little after sunrise. The air felt lighter there, almost thin after the weight of the ridge. My men stepped out of the truck with quiet relief. No one cheered. No one spoke about what happened. They only checked their gear, counted their rounds, and waited for my call. Each of them carried the same tight look in their eyes, a look I had seen on men returning from harder nights overseas. When I radioed battalion, the line answered on the first try. The voice sounded normal, calm, almost casual. They asked why we had left the outpost early. I gave a simple report. 1 wounded, minor structural damage, and unconfirmed contact with unknown personnel. I kept it clean. They asked for no details. That silence told me more than any follow-up question could have. A state guard convoy met us halfway back to the main road. Their lieutenant stepped out, scanning the tree line like he expected to find fresh tracks. His men searched our trucks, then followed us back up the ridge. I went with them, though half my squad stayed in the valley for the wounded private. When we reached the outpost again, the place looked untouched. No broken windows, no damaged door frames. No shell casings except our own. The claymores still sat in place. The panels in the comm shack showed no power. The tape machine no longer held a spool. The maps had vanished. The cabinet looked empty except for dust. The lieutenant walked the perimeter with me. He crouched near the fence and brushed his hand across the soil. No prints, no signs of movement. Only a smooth surface that looked like it had rested undisturbed for days. He asked if we were sure about the contact. I said yes. He looked at me for a long moment, then wrote a short note in his pad. The guard medic checked the injured private next. His knee had improved overnight. The pressure in his chest had passed. He could not explain the change. None of us tried to. The guard medic called it fatigue, though his eyes carried uncertainty. The contractors arrived by noon. They walked through the outpost with relaxed steps, talking about schedules and delays. They acted as if the place had never seen a single round fired. They never asked why half the squad kept their rifles ready while they unloaded tools. I stayed near the comm shack, watching them disconnect the old lines. Every cable they pulled looked dry, old, and unused for years. One of the contractors asked why someone had cut the fuel line on the second truck. I told him it must have snagged on a rock. He nodded without comment, though the cut had been too clean for that. We left the ridge before evening. My men sat quietly in the back of the truck, each lost in his own thoughts. The fog stayed behind us like a curtain drawn across the trees. When the ridge finally slipped from view, the whole squad seemed to exhale at once. That night, we returned to base. IR kept the debrief short. They accepted my report without pushing for clarity. A field-grade officer pulled me aside and asked about how the men reacted, how they handled confusion, how quickly they set defenses. He never asked about the radio messages or the tape machine. He only noted our discipline and cohesion. His questions felt rehearsed, like someone else had shaped the script. I walked out of the building with a strange thought turning in my mind. Some nights, a place tests you. Other nights, something behind the place does. And whatever lived in that ridge had watched us more closely than anyone on the radio ever could. Weeks passed before the ridge slipped out of our daily talk. The squad returned to regular duties, though each man carried a quiet edge he had not shown before. No one asked to revisit the site. No one wanted to. The injured private healed fast and acted like nothing had happened. But sometimes I caught him staring at empty corners as if checking for footsteps no one else heard. A month later, a civilian and another officer called me into a small room. They asked steady questions about decision-making, communication under stress, and how fast the squad adapted. Their focus stayed on behavior, not the events. They never mentioned the strange orders. They never asked about the voices. They only noted my answers and thanked me for my time. Their calm tone unsettled me more than the ridge itself. Near winter, I passed through that region again while driving home on leave. I took a long detour up an old county road and reached the fence where the outpost once stood. Every building had been torn down. Fresh earth covered the spot. A new warning sign faced the tree line, clean and bright against the fading afternoon. The tower was gone. No footprints marked the soil. I drove back to the valley and checked into a small motel. After dark, I stepped outside for air. Through the trees high above, a faint red blink showed once. Then again, slow, even, measured. I held my breath without meaning to. My old handheld radio sat in my pack. On a quiet impulse, I turned it on and scanned the lower bands. Static filled the speaker in soft rising waves, then dipped with a rhythm I recognized far too well. For a moment, the static cleared, and a short broken call came through. It used a call sign I had not spoken since overseas. I waited for a second reply. Only the static answered. I think about that ridge more often than I admit. Not every day, but often enough that it settles into the back of my mind whenever the weather turns heavy. I have served in places where danger showed itself plainly, where the ground told the truth and the sky held no secrets. That hill was different. It shaped its own rules, and we walked inside them without knowing. Sometimes, when I cannot sleep, I replay the moments in the comms shack. The hum of the old panels, the soft turn of the tape, the voice that should not have been there. I remind myself that I checked the wiring with my own hands. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Yet no record remains. Only memory carries it forward. My squad scattered across new assignments. A few left the service soon after. When I hear from them, none mentions the ridge directly. They talk around it, choosing words that keep the night at a distance. I understand why. Some places are easier to forget when left unnamed. Now and then, during long drives through quiet towns, I scan the radio out of habit. Most nights, it gives nothing but a soft wash of static. But once in a while, the pattern shifts, rising and falling in that familiar slow rhythm. On those nights, I lower the volume and keep my eyes on the road. I do not answer back. I learned my lesson on that ridge. Some signals are better left unheard. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And for more amazing horror stories, just click the ones showing right now on your screen.